Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our Thursday edition of Point of View, and we're going to cover quite a bit over the next couple of hours. I might just mention as a program note that next hour we will be talking with Rasool Berry. He is the host of the podcast Where You From, and we're going to be talking about blind spots in race and justice, one of his podcasts. So we'll get into the issue of race again, and that'll certainly be one that I think you will appreciate. And then in the 2 o'clock hour, Joshua Chatraw will be with us as we talk about telling a better story, how to talk about God in a skeptical age. But before we do that, let me just give you another program note. About a half an hour, Ivy Nichols will be with us. We're going to talk about public schools and some of the things that are going to change because of the pandemic, and also why a number of parents and even students are starting to say, maybe I need to rethink all of this, especially college students saying going to college means just staying at home, taking online classes, and I'm paying $40,000 for that. And a lot of parents are starting to say, in light of some of the radicalism we're seeing out in the streets, maybe that's coming from the classroom, you think? And maybe we need to rethink some of that in terms of our own family. So we're going to get into that with her. But okay, that one side is winning when they're really bold about their claims and they can do things with impunity. That's a lesson I learned a long time ago, growing up around the San Francisco Bay Area, growing up around Berkeley. When the radicals began to take over, they began to make more and more demands, and they knew that they were on the march. And a good example of that, let's just go for a minute just to Boston, although I can go all over the country, in which the city of Boston decided to remove the damaged statue of Christopher Columbus. Now, was this done because there was a ongoing debate and discussion about whether or not it's good to have Christopher Columbus? No. It was vandalized, and the head of Christopher Columbus was beheaded by vandals. So once the head was removed, the Boston mayor said, you know what, it's probably just time to take it out. And, of course, the head had been cut off back in 2006 and doused with red paint with the words Black Lives Matter. So, first of all, it's a bit of a stretch to say that Christopher Columbus unleashed on this country all the things that are now alleged to have happened. But was Christopher Columbus always the most positive individual? Of course not. And yet he was sort of, for a while, that's sometimes the patrons say, which is why, for the Italian community at least, which is why some of these monuments were up there. And, you may have a good, compelling argument for why we should take down Robert E. Lee. In just a minute, we're going to talk about taking down statues of Washington, Jefferson, everybody. We're going to talk about all that. But that's not really the way we are having these statues taken down, is it? Because the bottom line is the vandals destroy them, and then the mayors say, well, it's not worth putting it back up there. I understand that they're even talking about taking some statues down here in Dallas area just because they just don't want to have a fight over it. And a lot of this goes back to the rather strong argument that if you have slavery in your background, again, it's a little hard to make that for Christopher Columbus, but it's not hard for, it's in particular, CNN's Angela Rye to say, it is time to take down any statues of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, because George Washington was a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. We need to really either take down or rename the Washington Monument, take down or rename, and I'm being nice because you really sound like she just wanted to take down the Jefferson Memorial. And as I was sharing with Steve, who is our producer, I saw this coming decades ago because we had a conversation, and I think it was back in at least the 1990s, might have been in the 1980s, where Marvin Olasky, who was for a while a professor at University of Texas at Austin, but then became the editor of World Magazine, where she is to this very day, had written a very good book on the subject of leadership principles of our founders. And I thought about that the other day because one of the people we have on this program is a man by the name of Dr. Brent Taylor. He's joined us many times, of course, for a Millennial Roundtable. And his book on founding leadership has, of course, some chapters about what we can learn from the leadership skills of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Now, Franklin did own slaves, but he got rid of them and was really part of the abolition movement. So I don't know if his various statues have to come down, but certainly George Washington and Thomas Jefferson do. It's even hard to imagine now doing an interview, unfortunately. Sorry about that, Brent Taylor, because I'm just not sure that's going to happen anymore because we have so many people now calling for this destruction of all of these statues. And, of course, I've got all sorts of other ones. Statues of Christopher Columbus not only were targeted by protesters in Massachusetts, but in Virginia. You have a memorial there, Richmond, Virginia, that was taken down. And, of course, while we focus on not only statues, any book or video that could be, or movie that could be critical, Gone with the Wind is the one everybody's been talking about. Now, it turns out maybe the HBO isn't completely eliminating Gone with the Wind from its lineup, but they're putting it in a different category, so it's sort of the same way. And so you have this sort of ongoing attempt to see what you can do to remove all of these statues. And again, part of it is simply, if you disagree with me, then you are on the opposite side. And as we've talked about before, this book that came out a while back on the coddling of the American mind, and we had Jonathan Haidt on the program. The first one was What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Weaker, which is the idea that I can't let you actually say anything or do anything that might be contrary to my position. The second untruth, always trust your feelings. But the one that I think is surfacing in a lot of these debates is the third untruth, and that is life is a battle between good people and evil people. It's not that we say you and I disagree, and I disagree with your viewpoint. No, because you disagree with me, you are evil. And as I pointed out, I saw this coming when we were talking at the time with Marvin Olasky, because he, of course, had some leadership principles and used George Washington as an example. And I had somebody call in and say, why would I want to learn anything about the leadership principles of George Washington? He was a slave owner. And to his credit, Marvin Olasky said, well, that's true. And he went through some of the history and that kind of stuff. But I think we can still learn from an individual, even if they were slave owners. And she said, no, we can't. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Decades ago, you were already having people say, nope, that's a deal breaker. I don't need to learn anything from anybody who has engaged in any activity that I would disagree with. And, of course, slavery was an evil activity, no doubt about it. But nevertheless, you are now starting to see individuals going out of their way to say it is time to take down not only statues of Robert E. Lee, but statues of George Washington, statues of Thomas Jefferson, and in some cases, rather than even having a debate in the city council about it, we will vandalize it. And because, again, the mayors in most of these cities are running scared, they simply say, okay, you win, and so they take down that without any kind of debate. Of course, you can sort of ask yourself the question, sooner or later there's going to be a backlash. What happens when paint is sprayed over Martin Luther King Jr.'s statue in Washington, D.C.? Okay, that's a different kind of issue, and we'll have to see if indeed something like that takes place. But if you want to talk about mayors that are afraid, how about what's going on in Seattle right now? Black Lives Matter have taken over a whole section of Seattle and have declared it another country. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We've all heard the phrase, the cure is worse than the disease. Some have applied that to the pandemic lockdown, but is that claim really true? Dr. Scott Atlas is both a physician and senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He and his colleagues looked at the accumulated years of life lost because of the lockdown. They used information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Bureau of Labor, along with various actuarial tables. Lost economic output in the U.S. alone is estimated to be 5% of GDP, or about $1.1 trillion for each month of the lockdown. They use a conservative average of one additional life lost for every 17 million of income lost, resulting in 65,000 lives lost in the U.S. for each month because of the economic shutdown. Then there are lives lost due to delayed or foregone health care. Some were prevented from getting screenings. Others avoided hospitals for fear of getting the virus. Treatment delays resulted in 8,000 U.S. deaths per month for another 120,000 years of remaining life. Missed strokes contributed an additional loss of 100,000 years of life loss for each month. Late cancer diagnosis lost 250,000 years of remaining life. Now, the expected lifetimes of COVID-19 patients who died account for about 800,000 lost years of life. Even the most conservative estimate for the life lost from the lockdown already exceeds 1.5 million years of lost life. Essentially, the lockdown will account for more years of lost life than the virus itself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the things I was just ending with in this last segment is what happens when we start defacing, for example, statues that even the liberal mob would say should not be defaced. And, of course, Andrew reminded me of another example. Just the other day, you might have seen one in Georgia where actually this was a monument to those who were black soldiers, African-American soldiers, and that one was defaced. Or the one out of Philadelphia, the statue of Matthias Baldwin. And on it, matter of fact, I'm looking at it right now, they got the word colonizer, which was not the case, first of all. He should not have been defaced because he was an abolitionist. He fought against the issue of the slave trade. He funded schools for black children out of his own pocket, and go through the long, long list about his stories. And this, if nothing else, just illustrates not only do people have a biased view of history, in most cases they have an incorrect view of history. And a lot of that simply comes from some of the textbooks that have existed for some time on campuses and in high school classrooms. And right now they're promoting, of course, the 1619 Project, which again just wants to say that the founding of the country has to do with slavery, not with freedom and the Declaration, and on and on and on. So this may be why we'll be having this conversation in just a few minutes with Ivy Nichols about what's going on in the public schools and whether or not some of that might change in the future. But let me move away from statues. That's just one story, because I did mention just as we came to the break something that hasn't been covered terribly well by the mainstream media, as illustrated by the fact that the governor of the state of Washington was asked about this autonomous zone in Seattle. Now, you got to understand, this is the governor of the state of Washington. Now, I will admit the state capital is not in Seattle. It's further south. It's in Olympia. But again, you are the governor of the state, and this is happening in the largest city in your state. And he basically said, I don't know anything about it. And I thought, well, he's either pretending not to know about it, or if all you do is watch the programs you agree with, if you live in your silo, maybe you don't. And maybe now, for the first time, some of you are listening to the fact that these protesters carrying Black Lives Matter banners, and I think a lot of them are Black Lives Matter movement, but I suspect Antifa's there as well, and a variety of others, because oftentimes they've wanted to co-opt some of these protests, basically have set up what they say is an autonomous zone, and you have about a good number of them in this 6-block radius around the East Police Precinct. So then you also have them taking over, essentially, as I understand it, one of those police headquarters as well. And so because of that, the police are not wanting to go in there, because you can imagine what would happen. These are individuals who, if nothing else, want to establish a country inside a city in our country, if you can get a handle on that for just a minute. And so then you also have the inability for the police in Seattle to do too much, because the mayor actually, along with the various Seattle police, banned the use of tear gas for 30 days, because that was seen as a problem. So we're going to have a standoff, and I remember some of these in the 1960s when you'd have a standoff where somebody'd have a sit-in the office of the president of a university, or you'd have a People's Park in Berkeley. I mean, like I said, some of this is just familiar territory for me. But that was not enough, because as much as the mayor has really gone along with Black Lives Matter, and it would be Jenny Durkin, now 300 protesters then marched into the lobby of the mayor's office carrying Black Lives Matter banners, chanting, "Durkin must go." And this was led by the Seattle City Council member. There's a couple on the council that are socialist. I'm not calling them that. That's what they call themselves. And so they were then not only taking over a 6-block radius, but they also have been taking over, for at least a time, the mayor's office, and doing all they can to actually prevent any kind of civil action taking place, any kind of, if you will, police action. And one of the groups of Black Lives Matter now has sued the city of Seattle over, quote, unnecessary violence that was carried out against protesters by the police. So that's the standoff in Seattle. And you might say, well, is that ever going to end? Yes, if you meet their incredible demands, and I could read all of those off, but since right now most of the people listening to this broadcast are not in Seattle, let me read the demands that come from Black Lives Matter in Fort Worth. By the way, both Dallas, Fort Worth, and San Antonio have received these demands. And if nothing else, the reason I want to use the Fort Worth demands is there's a shorter list. The list from Seattle would take me all of this segment. These are the demands from Black Lives Matter in Fort Worth. We demand to defund the police. We demand that the Fort Worth Independent School District immediately remove all Fort Worth police officers from our schools. We demand the Fort Worth Independent School District immediately cease all contracts with the Fort Worth Police Department. We demand the demilitarization of the Fort Worth Independent School District, and that they should no longer have access to militarized gear. We demand the creation of a community oversight board not appointed by the city with subpoena power. We demand the disbarment of police, especially in response to nonviolent offenses. And we demand a substantial portion of the Fort Worth budget be allocated to creating mental health response teams, youth homeless programs, and a young people's task force on race relations, etc. That's just Fort Worth. By the way, if you're wondering, San Antonio has those, but a lot of others. In particular, they demand that there be a minimum payout of $250,000, $250,000 to the family of any unarmed civilian unlawfully killed by police. And then, of course, an end to no-knock raids, and I can go down the list, but it just gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're dealing with. And lest you be convinced that, well, maybe we just need to give in to some of the demands, my first article here today is by Kyle Smith, which I'll probably get into more in the National Hour. Begging the mob's forgiveness doesn't work. And it's got a picture of the New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees and takes you through, some of the things that have happened to him. And I thought I might also add to that we gave you a pretty good list the other day of everybody from Ellen DeGeneres. But I thought J.K. Rowling was one that I've actually found the actual Twitter post that got her in trouble. And that is on one of these posts, this goes back a couple of days now, goes back almost 5 days now, okay? That was where she was talking about where there were these things about people who menstruate or have a period, and she says, I'm sure we used to use a word for that. Well, help me out. Wumben, whooprin. She's making fun of the fact these are called women, not people, okay? She's kind of just poking a finger a little bit. It's this idea that these are transgender women when they really are men who have now converted over to that. And so then she got some pushback. So then she wrote the Twitter post that got her in trouble. If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. And, of course, the pushback on that one on June 6th then led to some others where people were criticizing it. And so she had to come back again and said, look, the idea that women like me who've been empathetic to the trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, hate trans people because they think sex is real, have lived consequences, is a nonsense. And then after that, there were just a series of posts in which she has been pilloried, vilified, criticized simply by expressing basic biology, because you can't even challenge basic biology anymore. And so, again, you can see that one of the lessons, and we'll talk more about this in the next hour, is that even when you try to capitulate, even when you ask for forgiveness, even when you try to apologize, even when you try to clarify your remarks, even when you try to come that direction, it is not enough. And if you need any more evidence, look at the fact that right now the mob wants to get rid of the mayor of Minneapolis, wants to get rid of the mayor of Seattle, who are, I guess, I think we could all agree, some of the most liberal progressive mayors in the country. And what does that mean for the rest? So anyway, let's take a break, and when we come back, let's look ahead to education. What is school going to look like in the fall? There's some different options for that. And at the same time, I thought by bringing Ivy Nichols in here, it will give you just a little bit of a preview of what will be out in the next Outlook magazine. And if you don't receive our Outlook magazine, I would encourage you to take the time to visit our website and get a copy and say, yeah, I'd like to have that come, because if nothing else, we would like to educate you with not only what we say on air, but what we write in our various articles. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
In studio with me today is Ivy Nichols. She is on staff here at Point of View, has written numerous articles. By the way, if you already receive our Outlook magazine, you know who she is because she's been on the program with us occasionally and has certainly written almost every single month an article. This latest one that will be out in the July issue of Outlook, Public School Monopolies, Game On. And if nothing else, it's just a reminder that as we get back to schools in the fall, it's going to be very different. And if nothing else, because not only you've written about this, but you've also been in homeschool, I think you are in a perfect position to address this. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about if you don't get the Outlook magazine, this is one you probably want to get. But first of all, Ivy, thank you for joining us. And school in the fall is going to be really different, don't you think?
Yes, it really is. And I think part of the surprise, I guess, is that we actually don't really know everything that's going to happen. I was even just searching for updates just a couple minutes ago, and they don't really have that many. So one of the articles that I referenced in my article about public schools was by Emily Tate, and it was called "What Will Schools Do in the Fall?" Here are 4 possible scenarios. So she talks about 4 different options that schools have. They have something called brick to click, which is where they can start off in school, but if their school happens to have a resurgence of COVID-19 or their state or their district, they may have to go back to online learning more so, which I think, we're even seeing other countries around the world that are having resurgences, so it's likely that that could happen. Her second one is called click to brick. So they may start off online as they're doing right now, and then if things get better and they can figure out how to do it more safely, may transition to at least part-time in the school. Or they may just do blended learning, where they just start off the school year planning to do part of the time in school and part of the time online, or just keep doing online learning, which I think is kind of difficult for children, especially the young children that are going through this spring.
One of the things that I'm kind of watching on this side is some of my colleagues have been involved in these homeschooling co-ops. And you're familiar with that because you were homeschooled yourself. And it's one thing to do homeschool co-op and when you're face-to-face and teaching like a science lab. Matter of fact, somebody's been on this program with before, Dr. Raybon Bolin, he spends some time teaching them science and doing advanced biology. Well, you can't exactly dissect a frog online. See, there's some real limitations to that in the first place, but it also just gets back to how would you be able to teach physics and chemistry and biology in high schools? You might be able to do some of that online, but it's kind of a different set of circumstances. So whether you end up with a brick to click or click to brick or blended, my goodness, I think there are some challenges to actually teaching online. And of course, if indeed we say, well, we need to keep kids at home, something else you're writing about here. Wait a minute. I mean, with the schools closed right now, a lot of young people depend on food from the schools. Parents really kind of depend on the schools to be the daycare for their kids so they can go back to work. So there may be a lot of pressure to go back to school, but it may not exactly be anything like what we had just a year ago. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that, and especially about your comment about science classes. So I was homeschooled all the way up through the end of high school, and I took anatomy and physiology at a homeschool co-op. So we met once a week. And so we were able to dissect fetal pigs and sharks and all sorts of things. And so that was kind of an advantage. It was kind of like the blended learning that they're going to have, where we had a textbook that we studied at home, but we came once a week to actually do dissections. Yes. So we ended up getting a good education, but we weren't around people as much. Yeah. So I think if schools could either adopt something like that, or the children that may be transitioning to homeschool co-ops, when they have that model of we plan to only see each other a few times a week and then you study a textbook at home, I think that's even easier than actually doing it online.
You talk about this, that having been in a homeschool situation, it gave you the freedom to go on field trips, to have one-on-one instruction and all sorts of things. And I've always been a real fan of anything that allows for that to take place, because homeschooling lots of times is delight-directed learning. There may have been a time where all of a sudden you're really into, as a matter of fact, as people read your bio, they're going to find out about Goldberry's Cottage and your jewelry that you produce and things like that. Or young kids are really into a military, and so you get a chance to study that. And some kids learn very quickly. Others don't learn as fast. And it seems in a homeschool situation, you can pace it and you're not held back by one or two kids in a big classroom who don't get it. And everybody else has to sit around looking bored while finally you're able to get the slow kids up to speed with the fast kids, right?
Yeah, that's totally true, especially because parents are there helping the kids, or they're in small co-op classes. They get a lot more one-on-one instruction, and either the parents or the teachers are able to see what things they're learning and what things they're missing, and then explain them to them, each individual problem, and tailor things toward their interests. Like, being able to have the freedom to take history, or to be able to get a box of rocks from Arkansas and check where are they on the different hardness scale, or go through walks in the neighborhood and talk about cumulonimbus clouds and what do those mean for weather. Those are things that I learned as a kid when I was really little, because my parents had the time to talk about those.
Right.
And when we were able to experience them, they stuck so much better. I think kids that are stuck in a classroom, and especially online, so hard for them to absorb that information because it's not interesting and it's not interactive.
It's not where they are. And speak to this for just a minute before we get into all the challenges that have been raised about homeschooling, because some people listening right now say, I've kind of watched this and I didn't expect that I was going to be a homeschool parent, but guess what? My kids are at home, they're learning online. Maybe I could do that. What would you say? Because it seems to me that for some people, the idea, as you said, of teaching your own kids is kind of daunting, but you don't necessarily have to go it alone, do you?
No, definitely not. I think maybe for some parents who aren't that familiar with homeschooling, they may think, well, I'm not an expert in science. I don't know everything that's happened in history. How can I teach all those things to my kids? But you really don't have to be an expert in really any of these subjects. There are homeschool book fairs and other different curriculums online that have been time tested by experts that you can get and then learn alongside your kids with the teacher manual or other instruction as well, which is what my family did, and we were able to get a really good education.
I think of who will be sitting in that chair tomorrow. That's Penna Dexter, and she homeschooled her kids back in a day when it wasn't all that popular. So what she would do is close the curtains in her house because she didn't want somebody looking in and saying, why are the kids there? She made it a point to not even necessarily go to the park until it was about the time that kids would get out of school. But things have changed dramatically. Back then, there were 2 or 3 kind of manuals on homeschool. We didn't have the internet. Yes, I know it's hard for you young people to remember. There was a time when there was not the internet, and we didn't have all the co-ops and those kinds of things. So now, in some respects, being a homeschool teacher is a lot easier. I'm not saying it's perfect or easy, but a whole lot easier than it was, say, for Penna Dexter just a few decades ago, right?
That's true, and especially legally, people don't have to be worried about it, which is really great. In the Dallas area, which is where I went, we had a homeschool prom that was about 1,000 people every year. We had our own homeschool football team, and now I think they have cheerleaders and all sorts of things. So it's easy for parents to get connected while doing that, and either to teach their kids all their curriculums at home and have them outsource their social activities a little bit, even with things like Awana that aren't necessarily a homeschool program. Or to either have them take select classes from different co-ops. Like you can take one from one co-op and one from another co-op and fit it into your schedule whenever is convenient for you and with whichever teachers you've heard that were recommended.
Let's, if we can, kind of get into the whole question of homeschooling that has really been challenged. We've talked about this before, that if you look at the Harvard Magazine or you look at some of the articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, I think part of it is being criticized because if lots of parents say, maybe I will think about homeschooling, then the public schools don't get as much money because they don't have as many students. And I think also there's this sense of control. And so maybe let me just take a break so we don't interrupt you. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about this because indeed, when we look at homeschooling, first of all, you have in here a quote by John Stossel, which we used just a while back in terms of looking at the nation's report card, this argument that, well, we need to make sure that these kids learn history and civics. And as I just pointed out when we were talking about some of these statues that are being destroyed and things like that, sometimes they don't even know that. But more importantly, when you ask fourth graders which country was the leading communist nation during the Cold War, and when only one out of five get the answer Soviet Union, maybe we're not doing such a great job sometimes in the government schools. And so let's talk about, when we come back from the break, the attack on homeschooling and some of the benefits of homeschooling, because that's part of your article. And if you find yourself saying you would really like to read this even before it comes out in Outlook, I believe we have posted your article for people to read today. So simply go down to the website, Public School Monopolies Game On by Ivy Nichols. And we've posted it there. You'll get a sense of an advance article that will appear in the July issue of Outlook. And if you aren't already receiving the regular monthly Outlook, we'd love to send it to you. And you can leave us a note, and we'll be glad to make sure you get that. Let's take a break. We'll continue with Ivy Nichols right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Ivy Nichols in studio with us for a few more minutes. And if you would like to read her piece on public school monopolies, Game On, we are at the moment working our way through that. And if you'd like to read it, it's available on our website, pointofview.net. But we've been talking about another part of your article on homeschooling, so I'd like people to read it. And let me, just before we finish this hour, mention that you will receive it, of course, if you get the July issue of Outlook. And so we're giving you kind of a preview. But what about these attacks on homeschooling? You've seen the Harvard magazine. Harvard University has a magazine, and the front of it actually implies with the lead author, and they were even going to do a seminar or colloquium, which then got canceled because of the pandemic, which is all talking about the threat of homeschooling. I didn't know you homeschoolers were such a big threat. What about that?
Well, I think that part of the reason that they feel threatened, especially because I was thinking it makes sense for the public schools to be worried that they won't have the children come back and they won't maybe receive as much funding. But what has Harvard got to do with it? I mean, they're not teaching elementary school. But I think that since we have this government program in our schools all across the U.S., people who support that program and who do not support being taught other sides or outside information or questioning perhaps some things that are in it, get really anxious when they see that people may be homeschooling because they're not sure exactly what they're going to be taught and if they're going to be taught the same program that they want every kid across the country to learn. And so I think that schools like Harvard, maybe that may be a little bit more liberal. I'm thinking, what if these children are taught conservative values at home? What if they're...
Heaven forbid, yes.
Yeah, what if they're not taught these different liberal things? And then they come to Harvard and, they kind of have this investment in we want every kid to believe all these liberal ideals so that we can move our country in this way. So that may be why they're scared a little bit.
I thought it was kind of interesting because and I know people that, young people that have been homeschooled who then have gone to the Ivy League schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and they all do very well. So first of all, the argument that they're not getting a good education is sort of flawed. And I want you to talk about that because I think you have some numbers on SAT scores and things like that. But then the other concern is as well, they may not be teaching our values. And I'm thinking, they might be, for example, letting them actually read the Declaration of Independence, maybe read some of the founding fathers, really know a little bit more about this history than the average young person who goes off to those Ivy League schools would really know. And so in some respects, it's kind of like, well, we're losing control. But in some respects, that's why I think there are probably some parents right now saying, my kids seem to be learning pretty well at home. Their behavior has improved dramatically when they're not around some of these other kids. Maybe I'd have got to think about this idea of homeschooling. But it does seem to me that the real concern that is cited in some of these articles in the New York Times, Washington Post, at Harvard, is that these individuals just aren't going to be able to do as well academically. But you give us some facts and figures in this article that actually go the other direction, right? Seems like homeschoolers are doing better.
Yes, that's true. Apparently homeschoolers, we know that they do better at SAT scores, but, let me see, who was it?
Yeah, I think it's 30% higher.
Corey DeAngelis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the homeschoolers regularly score about 30% higher on average on SAT tests. So the argument that they're not doing as well is not good. Of course, there are some people that fall through the cracks, but that happens in public schools as well. We do learn in homeschooling different democratic values that children in public schools may not actually be having them sink in as well. You can read the article and see the results of that. But in high school, we were reading the actual original documents of, Marx and Engels and Locke and Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. And we were learning about capitalism and socialism and what actually happens to those countries that adopt socialist principles. So Harvard also, one of the articles that they published was worried that children could be abused by parents, which of course no one wants to happen. But another study showed that students that go to government schools, I think it's 1 in 10 of them. 1 in 10 children attending government schools will experience sexual misconduct by school employees by the time they graduate from high school. That's a pretty high statistic, and that's super sad. So I think that definitely makes the argument that, if anything, public schools in that regard are probably at least as dangerous as homeschools.
When I was looking through some of the material in particular, I'm thinking of the one in Harvard Magazine, then to pick out a story of somebody who actually had a poor experience, which is oftentimes somebody that whose parents were anarchists, who are anti-government, and that isn't really homeschooling, but what I call home fooling and things like that. Yeah, of course you're going to have an occasional story like that, but if you can think about kind of logic 101, if indeed the scores of homeschoolers is always 30% higher on SAT tests than government schools, That should tell you all you really need to know. And so then to reach in and find some example of abuse or some example of somebody who was not qualified to teach your kids and actually was trying to, if nothing else, use that as a justification to maybe depart entirely from the society and government is not really a very good argument. But if nothing else, back to this very important issue, you said, if anything, the argument from the author of the Harvard article, she should really be, if nothing else, calling for a ban in the government school, as you said. So you kind of take the argument and turn it around. If indeed you're really concerned about abuse, well, we can pretty much document some of the most significant evidence of abuse, according to one of the individuals you cite, actually sometimes takes place in the government schools.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that some families who are having to teach their children online through this different semester that we're experiencing and that's coming to a close, I think a lot more of them are becoming interested in homeschooling because they're seeing, well, maybe the stuff that our kids are learning from school isn't actually as great as we thought it was going to be. And maybe with one-on-one instruction, they would actually get a better education. So I think that we may see a shift of some people being more interested. Some people will have to and will want to send their kids back to public schools, which is totally fine. But it will be great for those people who are interested in homeschooling to have had that experience, I think.
One thing that's kind of interesting, we have the incoming president of the Association of Christian Schools International, and they are providing all sorts of material for parents who are educating their kids at home because they recognize that even though they are really working with the Christian schools, they recognize all these Christian schools are probably going to do some homeschooling as well. So there's some great resources there at acsi.org to find if you are homeschooling. And, of course, I've always said, Ivy, every parent really is a homeschooler one way or another. It's whether you're doing it 100% of the time or 10% of the time. Hopefully you're doing it more than 10. But anyway, that is one of those very powerful arguments. So, again, we've posted your article here, Public School Monopolies Game On, and I really appreciate you writing it and joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Let me just mention, just before we take a break, we will get into some other issues in the news in just a few minutes. This is just one of the articles in the Outlook magazine that's coming out in July. Now, we don't take too much time to promote each month the various articles, but this one's on the subject of education, and we talk about homeschooling, we talk about public schools, we talk about the universities. I just wonder whether 20 million college students are going to show up on campus this fall. I think there's going to be some really significant changes taking place there. So we cover all of that. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'm a parent or a grandparent and I'm kind of concerned about education, it is one of the reasons to even just send in a small gift to Point of View, because as you do, then you'll receive the Outlook magazine. And if you say, I'd like just to get a sample copy, I think we could get that as well. You can simply go to the website pointofview.net. For those of you out there that say, I'd like to read a little bit more about homeschooling, I understand In the Works is a booklet on the subject of homeschooling that'll come out in the future. I won't write that because I don't know anything about it other than the interview I'm doing right now. So these are just great benefits that come from participating with Point of View, and I hope that you will do so. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and I am so grateful that you had a chance to join us, and would love to hear some of your comments a little bit later as we get into some of these very important issues. And I might just give you kind of an understanding that, first of all, we got a couple of articles we're going to work our way through, and then we're going to be talking with Rasool Berry. He's a teaching and online pastor of a church in Brooklyn, has been with Crew, and he has this podcast, Where You From, is what it's called. Where You From, that's what it's called. And anyway, he's got one of his podcasts on blind spots in race and justice. And so I thought we would spend some time looking at and finding some of the blind spots we may have about this issue of race and racial reconciliation. So I'll be talking with him. And of course, welcome your phone calls in that regard. Then we'll be talking in the next hour with Joshua Chatraw. His book is entitled Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age, kind of refocusing how we can really make the case for Christianity, and I know that you will appreciate that conversation as well. But for just a few minutes, given the turmoil in America right now, we might, if nothing else, focus a little bit of time and attention on the fact that as a person makes a statement, which I think in most cases is true, and then is criticized by the progressive mob, especially the mob out there in the streets, is there a place for apology? Is there a place for forgiveness? And so the first article I've posted here is by Kyle Smith, Begging the Mob's Forgiveness Doesn't Work. And I'm going to give you some examples of how you would expect that even if somebody said something in an inarticulate way, that you would think that people would be willing to forgive. I mean, most of us are willing to forgive and forget. Most of us live in a live and let live kind of world, but that's not really the case for the radical left. And the example that is used here, you can see it if you even look at the article, hold it up for those of you seeing it, you can see they show a picture of the quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, Drew Brees, who I think actually made a very articulate statement, but nevertheless, as Kyle Smith points out, after the actual riots, then we have the metaphorical riots. Reputations get burned down, careers get windows smashed in, characters get assassinated. And he said attacking Drew Brees for expressing a widely held patriotic belief about, honoring the flag is about as rational as setting fire to a gas station. By the way, I've oftentimes said that maybe the best thing we could do is just stop doing the national anthem at places where people are just going to disrespect it anyway. I certainly get a tremendous amount of excitement and enthusiasm when, for example, a military group honors the flag, but when you look out there and a good number of the athletes aren't even from the United States, a lot of them are shifting, they're not even looking, they're not even paying attention. That's such a good idea. But nevertheless, for him to have been so criticized, that's when Tony Dungy, who, by the way, has been on the program with us, matter of fact, been in studio with us, who, by the way, in case you're not familiar, is a former coach and a commentator, African-American, said, Drew Brees can't be afraid to say what he said, and he can't be afraid to say, okay, I don't agree with you, but let's talk about this. We can just say anything sometimes happen we don't agree with. Hey, I'm done with this and that person. That doesn't make sense. And so, of course, Drew Brees, first of all, made some statements, then apologized for it, and now just watching and his wife and others trying to get back into any kind of good graces. It just illustrates again, if you have opinions, express them, but stop trying to worry about trying to make people like you, because guess what? Sometimes once you've crossed a line, once you've deviated just a little bit from the radical idea, you're going to be vilified, and that is the case. And if you don't think so, let's look at what's happening in Seattle at the moment. If you're not familiar, first of all, the Black Lives Matters individuals, protesters, have taken over a 6-block radius around the East Police Precinct. Now, by the way, I don't think it's all just Black Lives Matter. I think there's probably Antifa and everything else there. So oftentimes even a legitimate protest sometimes gets co-opted. So I'm well aware of the fact that we're dealing with some of this. But nevertheless, they've taken over part of the city of Seattle and actually declared it a separate country. You know, I know, got to smile about that, but they call it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And the retreat from the police have made it likely that it's going to be there for some time. By the way, does anybody really seriously think the police is going to go in there? Because already the mayor of Seattle and the Seattle police have already banned the use of tear gas for 30 days. There is actually a lawsuit right now that the group brought against the city based upon what they feel was some kind of violence that was taking place. So we'll see where that takes us. But if you think, well, by capitulating to the demands of the radical left, everything will be fine, you would be wrong, because the mayor, that's Jenny Durkin, who has pretty much gone along with most of this, nevertheless found herself under siege, where a group led by one of the council people who's socialists. Matter of fact, I'm not saying that. They call themselves that. They the other day had about 300 protesters 2 days ago that came into the lobby of the city hall and carrying banners for Black Lives Matter, chanting "Durkin must go." So now we have a couple of different mayors that, even though they have been some of the most liberal progressive mayors in the country, that would be Minneapolis, that would be Seattle, nevertheless, they're not radical enough, and now there are individuals that want to remove them from office as well. That, of course, gets us back to another mayor, and that would be Jacob Fry. You remember I've told you about this before, who actually came front of the Black Lives Matter protesters and demonstrators, confessed his own brokenness and all the rest. But then when they demanded that he answer the question, are you supporting the defunding of the police department, he said, well, no, I can't do that. And at that point they say, go home, Jacob, go home. Shame, 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 and a lot of words I can't use here. The veto-proof majority in the Minneapolis City Council are not only going to try to disband the police of Minneapolis, but are going to try to defy him, and there are some people even saying they're going to run against him. Let's take another mayor. How about Muriel Bowser in Washington, D.C., used taxpayer money to actually name a street called Black Lives Matter Plaza. She even had them paint Black Lives Matter in huge yellow letters on the street. Was that enough? Nope. The movement, Black Lives Matter, actually accused her of engaging in tokenism. And so on Sunday, they went to another block and painted in huge letters, defund the police. And then when we come back from the break, I'll talk about maybe the plight of J.K. Rowling. Of course, you remember her from, of course, all of the Harry Potter series. I thought for just a minute, I might actually read the Twitter posts, because some people think she said something terrible. Actually, she just was pretty honest. And so we'll get into that. And all of that relates to the first article we've posted today on Progressive Mobs Don't Forgive. We come back, I want to talk a little bit more about a couple of other pieces that we have posted. And then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to talk with Rasool Berry and learn a little bit more about looking for the blind spots in our attitudes about race and justice. Lot to cover. We will do more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We've all heard the phrase, the cure is worse than the disease. Some have applied that to the pandemic lockdown, but is that claim really true? Dr. Scott Atlas is both a physician and senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He and his colleagues looked at the accumulated years of life lost because of the lockdown. They used information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Bureau of Labor, along with various actuarial tables. Lost economic output in the U.S. alone is estimated to be 5% of GDP, or about $1.1 trillion for each month of the lockdown. They use a conservative average of one additional life lost for every 17 million of income lost, resulting in 65,000 lives lost in the U.S. for each month because of the economic shutdown. Then there are lives lost due to delayed or foregone health care. Some were prevented from getting screenings. Others avoided hospitals for fear of getting the virus. Treatment delays resulted in 8,000 U.S. deaths per month for another 120,000 years of remaining life. Missed strokes contributed an additional loss of 100,000 years of life lost for each month. Late cancer diagnosis lost 250,000 years of remaining life. Now, the expected lifetimes of COVID-19 patients who died account for about 800,000 lost years of life. Even the most conservative estimate for the life lost from the lockdown already exceeds 1.5 million years of lost life. Essentially, the lockdown will account for more years of lost life than the virus itself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, a couple of articles we posted on the website, pointofview.net. One that I didn't post, but I thought I'd just read real quickly, because when we talk about this idea that progressive mobs do not forgive, poor J.K. Rowling, who again is best known as the author of the Harry Potter series and others, there is an attempt to try to cancel her career. Now, when you're that prominent, I don't think that works so well. But a lot of people have said, I can't believe she has been so anti the transgender population. And so I thought, just for a minute, let me just read the Twitter post, which came out about 5 days ago. And that is, she originally kind of started this by making fun of one of these articles. They were talking about people who menstruate, in other words, have a period. And just with a little bit of poking their finger said, people who menstruate, I'm sure we used to have a word for that. Maybe so. Somebody help me out. And she goes, woman. In other words, she's saying, if these are not people that have a period, these are women that have a period. And of course, she was, if nothing else, kind of being slightly critical of this idea that when you say I'm a transgender woman, well, you're a man who's become a woman, but you don't have the parts, if you will. Well, that led to criticism. So then Ness is the one that got her mostly in trouble, when she said, well, if sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. And if sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. She says, I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. And then there's a back and forth, and then it really takes off from there, in which he finally posted a couple. I won't read all of them. It said, the idea that women like me, who've been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way women are, hate trans people because they think sex is real, has lived consequences, is nonsense. And so by that time, there are people that are just outraged by her basically citing basic biology. And so it is an illustration of the fact that even when you cite basic biological facts, it's going to get you in trouble. Whether they'll cancel her career, because we have this cancel society now, we'll see. But nevertheless, it was just one more illustration of how the progressive mobs just don't forgive you. And even as you try to clarify that, that's not enough, because the reaction, in that case, is social media, isn't so great. But what are the reaction out there out on the streets? Well, we're starting to see statues coming down right and left. Now, is it because we are having an ongoing debate about whether or not that statue is appropriate? As in some cases, we've had debates about whether or not a Robert E. Lee statue should be there. No, the statues are coming down because they get vandalized and they get taken down. I'll use a good example. City of Boston removed the damaged statue of Christopher Columbus in North End Park after it was beheaded by vandals. And so the mayor finally said, they just beheaded it and there's no reason to fix it. We'll just simply take it down. And by the way, I might point out that the head was cut off back in 2006. The statue was doused with red paint. And with the words Black Lives Matter. So this isn't the first time. So now you have statues that are now being beheaded or vandalized in, Massachusetts and in Virginia and a variety of other places. And, of course, now the push is let's just get rid of any statue by anybody that might be offensive to anyone. And the best example of that came from CNN's Angela Rye, who simply says, we have got to take down statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And again, if I'd suggested a year ago that when we were having discussions and debates about whether or not Robert E. Lee statue should come down, eventually it's going to be Washington and Jefferson, you would have said, nah, that's exactly what it is. And now you're starting to have people call for either let's get rid of the Washington Monument or let's rename it. Let's get rid of the Jefferson Monument or Memorial and those kinds of things. And, as you can honestly ask the question, where does it lead? We will find out. But the fact that there is now such boldness, and now let's not have a debate about this and try to talk about the pros and cons. Let's just vandalize the statue, vandalize the memorial, and that's sufficient enough to then force a lot of these weak-kneed mayors to simply say, I guess we'll just take it down. And there's never a public discussion or debate about that. And that should concern you for sure. Well, let's change the topic and get into a couple of others. Very good piece that came out in The Hill, which is, again, the kind of the journal of record for Congress. This is an op-ed by Matt Schlapp, who, by the way, is the head of the American Conservative Union. 5 ways America would take a hard left turn under Joe Biden. And one of the things we're going to be doing as we get into the political campaigns and even get into the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention is give you a little bit of an idea what the world would look like. And to be honest, we haven't had so much insight in the past. When you had, for example, Barack Obama running, he was only a senator for a short time. We tried to give you some ideas about what that would look like, but those were somewhat speculation. Even with Donald Trump, there were a lot of ideas about what he might or might not do, but that was speculation. With Joe Biden, you have a 35-year career as a senator, as well as for 8 years of vice president, so we know pretty well. And so if you want to read this, we will certainly be covering these kinds of things in more detail as we get into next month and the month after, because we'll be looking at the conventions and the campaign. But here's his 5 points real quickly. First and foremost, America under Ronald Reagan's leadership may not have broken the back of the Soviet Union, but it certainly challenged that, and they point out that that time Senator Biden voted against funding for every single missile defense program. So do we think the Pentagon budget's going to go up or down under a Biden administration? I think you know the answer to that. Second, he says it wasn't just the Soviet Union that Senator Biden apparently did not view as a threat, but also the Chinese government. And even more recently, you had the statement by the former vice president that China going to eat our lunch. Come on, you know, that's not that bad. So it certainly doesn't have the same attitude towards China that certainly Donald Trump has. Number three, Biden's America would not cut taxes or even index the tax code for inflation, which has saved middle-class taxpayers, and I think we know that, if nothing else, as you start looking at the Democratic platform and some of the things that are already on Joe Biden's website, you can recognize that he does not want to cut taxes. He wants to spend it in very significant ways. Number four, America remade in Biden's image would lack medical savings accounts that allow a lot of people to save funds for medical expenses tax-free. And then number five, the fifth and final demonstration is, of course, Joe Biden is a strong advocate of abortion. Now, interesting enough, the New York Times has pointed out that there's been kind of a back and forth with Joe Biden over the issue of abortion. Up until fairly recently, at least supported the Hyde Amendment, but has turned against that and has pretty much accepted the most radical views on the subject of abortion. So if you'd like to read that, since right now, if the election were held today, you would have a President Joe Biden. And so a lot of people say, well, what would that look like? And I think this, and I've summarized it very quickly, gives you a little bit of a hint as to what America would look like under a President Joe Biden administration. But just before we take a break, you might remember the other day I talked about vaccines. One of the problems right now as we're developing these vaccines is as the number of deaths from COVID-19 are dropping, and in some places the infections are going down, we need volunteers to actually be injected with these vaccines to see if they work. But in order to understand that, you have to actually have the virus, and we're running a little bit low on the number of people that have the virus. So they're now starting to talk about what's called a challenge trial. That is where you would be intentionally infected with the virus, the coronavirus that gives you COVID-19. And the question is, would people be willing to volunteer to be injected first with the virus, and then again, if you're going to do a survey, half will get the test vaccine, half will get the placebo. So there's a possibility that you would get the virus, but you wouldn't even get the vaccine. And even if you get the vaccine, you don't even know if it would work. So I posted this article because it's just another one of those questions that I tried to ask as we talk about this issue of vaccines that a lot of people just haven't thought about. And kudos to John Stossel, because I sort of implied it the other day, but now he's got a very good piece that you might want to read. Are you ready to go and volunteer to be injected with the coronavirus and then go through a clinical trial where you may get the vaccine or you may get a placebo? Just think about that. It's a big question, and it's one that we'll have to answer sometime in the future, but I wanted to put that article on the website as well for you to read. When we come back, we're going to talk about blind spots in race injustice. That coming up right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
We're now joined by Rasool Berry, who has been with Cru since really 2000 and is the teaching and online pastor at Bridge Church in Brooklyn, New York. We have a link to his podcast, Where You From is the name of it, and again has been involved in various docuseries in pursuit of Jesus and others. And if nothing else, this particular episode that was part of the Where You From podcast on White Awake, or the whole issue of blind spots in race and justice, was one I thought we might feature. So, Rasool Berry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, man, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Give us a little view of your background, because you are in kind of a unique situation, which you've been with a kind of a parachurch ministry, but you also, of course, are teaching an online pastor at the church there in Brooklyn. So give us a little bit of your history, because it is fascinating, and I think it also helps us understand the podcast you put together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Philly, and to parents that had just converted to the Nation of Islam before I was born. That's where my name comes from. It's Arabic. It means prophet or messenger. And my parents broke up when I was very young. My father was murdered when I was 6. So I kind of grew up in a single-parent home and really just kind of drifted into secular life until my basically high school senior year, going into college, when the Lord really just showed me my need for salvation. And so I put my faith in Christ at 17 years old and just began to grow spiritually while I was at the University of Pennsylvania, which was this very interesting contrast of being in a pretty secular space that was an oftentimes critical and antagonistic toward faith while I was growing in my faith. And the experiences that I had there from the standpoint of really seeing the need for people to grow in their faith in Christ and have a witness made me want to be that kind of person for somebody else, somebody that a student could talk to and try to get questions answered about apologetics and things like that. And so that's what brought me on staff with Cru and, working with college students and now young adults to help them grow in their faith. And at the same time, I was also growing in my awareness of the various issues in our society, especially as it relates to race, racism, and culture and things like that. And so my journey through faith and my ministry life has oftentimes been trying to look at and analyze different social issues and concerns, especially race, through the lens of faith. And how does our understanding of the Bible and the scriptures and Jesus give us a helpful way to think about these things biblically and respond to them in a distinctly Christian way.
Very good. Let me just mention, too, that I know you've had quite an outreach with millennials, and this time next week we do a millennial roundtable. And last time I did it because the person that oftentimes hosts it was just getting over being pregnant and delivering, and now she's ready to join us again. So there's going to be a millennial roundtable, but I hope maybe you could join us, even if you can't join us in, obviously, in studio, certainly by phone, to bring some of the perspectives that you bring in, not only to millennials, but especially looking at it from an African-American experience, from experience there in Brooklyn and Philadelphia, because anything that we can get to get more diversity and an understanding of that from a scriptural point of view is really helpful. But talk about this podcast, Where You From? We have a link to it, and the particular episode that we featured here is the one on blind spots in race and justice. But you're really trying to attempt to have kind of a dialogue on some of these really important issues that have become front and center over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a partnership that I started with Our Daily Bread Ministries first with the In Pursuit of Jesus documentary, where they literally had me go all over the world, 5 different continents, talking to Christians about how they understand who Jesus is and what insights could their cultural background help me as an American understand and see a fuller picture of Christ and the gospel. And so that was kind of the starting point, and that experience kind of really whet my appetite on talking to people and exploring this question of faith and culture. And so we joined up again to launch this podcast, Where You're From. And it's funny because the title got started just because that was the first question I would ask people when we would sit down, where you from? Yeah. And I think that learning people's story and their backstory gives us a unique perspective into who they are and why they do the things they do and the ministry contributions. And so, as you mentioned, the featured episode that we especially decided to actually change the release of it in light of what was happening in our country with racial unrest and protests in response to the killing of George Floyd, was we decided to host or focus on this conversation I had with Daniel Hill, who's a pastor in Chicago, and who wrote this book called White Awake, which basically just kind of shares his journey from suburb kid that was pretty oblivious to his own cultural background to now someone who's written and who I even look to for great insights on the understanding of race and faith in the country. So it was a great story.
Let me just mention, too, for some of our listeners, we aren't even going to possibly cover all the material. And again, if you want to listen to that one, it's almost 40 minutes long, as some of the others are on hip hop and ethics and woke church and a variety of others. But let's see, maybe if we can just kind of cut to a couple of things that you thought were very interesting as you had Pastor Daniel Hill share. All of us have blind spots. What were some of the ones that he surfaced in his book and in the podcast conversation with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think really it starts with his first exposure and how his journey got started. He was at a wedding of someone that was whose parents immigrated from India, and it was a very culturally Indian wedding. And he said, "Man, Daniel said to the man, I really appreciate your culture. I wish I had one. But I don't. I'm just kind of white." And his friend responded to him, who's usually a very light-hearted person. He said, "Daniel, not only do you have a culture, but when your culture comes in contact with other cultures, it almost always wins or kind of dominates space." And that was really kind of surprising to him, unnerving. He didn't know what to do with that, and so that started him on this journey of discovery about what he meant by that and what is this aspect of culture and race and how that plays into it. And so the book really kind of, in Daniel's story, talks about his awareness of the reality of race in this country and how it was created to allocate, privileges. So essentially, this is how I look at it. The truth of the scripture that we're made in the image of God that we see in Genesis 1 and 2 is so kind of imprinted on the souls of humanity that whenever we seek to mistreat people, we have to come up with a different story than the Genesis story to make it okay to ourselves. So what we find is that in addition to, it wasn't just the issue of slavery and just, forcing people into labor and all of that, but it was also the story that was told that made people okay with it. And that story was one in which it said, well, either because they're not fully human or the curse of Ham, that there's reasons why it's okay for us to subjugate them. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is even though we had a war about this issue of slavery, and so that physical reality changed, the story never was fully confronted and exposed for the lie that it was. And so Daniel talks about that and how it's important for folks to not have blinders to that story, both white and black.
Well, and all the way through your podcast, there was something that kept ringing through my head, and it is, you may be familiar with Os Guinness, because Os Guinness, in a couple of his books, his most recent one, even all the way back to Gravedigger File, always reminds us of this famous Chinese proverb, why is a fish the last one to ask about water? Because a fish is surrounded by water. A fish knows nothing but water. And back to the illustration you used there of Daniel Hill, I'm in this white culture. I've always assumed it. And, of course, it gets back to some of the conversation we had earlier in the week about so-called male privilege or white privilege or anything else. If you just aren't even aware of the culture that you're in, there's an American culture. And sometimes when you have somebody outside of America come to this country, like the Indian couple, for example, and say, yeah, you don't even understand what some of the sacred cows are because you've taken them for granted. But when you go to another country, or you have somebody from another country come back to see that, and I want to take it out of race for just a minute because it's true in that regard. It's also true in the military. We've had people on here saying, it really is kind of hard to go and shoot somebody. So one of the things, unfortunately, they've done through war is created a story of the fact that these were evil people people or that they were whatever. And you can think of all the racial slurs used of Germans, of Japanese, and others to even kind of give people a justification for that. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about some of those blind spots, and in particular, as a Christian, how we can seek to not only uncover those blind spots, but also find some kind of racial reconciliation. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like to watch that or listen to that podcast, where are you from? We've got a link on our website, and we'll continue our conversation with Rasool Berry right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Please have with us for a few more minutes Rasool Berry, and I hope he can join us sometimes in the future when we have some of these discussions, but we wanted you to be aware of his podcast, Where Are You From? And in particular, this one on White Awake, which gets into some of the blind spots in race and justice. In the next hour, we're going to have Joshua Chatraw with us as we talk about his book, Telling a Better Story, in which he really says that we maybe need to reimagine apologetics. And Rasool, that kind of gets us into that conversation, because if there's one thing that we've learned about doing apologetics and doing evangelism, we have to be good listeners. And it seems to me right now in this issue of race, sometimes if we have blind spots or if we make assumptions that are incorrect, this is why listening is so important. And I would think that that's kind of, if you will, one of the application points that comes from your podcast. Tell us more.
Man, absolutely. That's such an important point, and that really is the foundation of even the title, Where You're From, it's an invitation to listen to perspectives and the stories of people from various backgrounds, all of whom have a firm, deep commitment to Jesus and a love for him, and also who have stories that when you start to explore them, they enhance your perspective about who Christ is, because have come to him from so many different ways and backgrounds, and they have learned to walk with him through those stories. And so I think you're absolutely right that listening is the first issue. And right now, of course, we know about the partisan divide. We know about just all the different divisions that occur in our society that make it hard to listen. Instead, we like to lob accusations and labels at people. And we need to get back to the art of simply hearing someone's pain, and in a very real way that I thought was even symbolically represented with the chants that you hear at many protests. And the thing that rung out about George Floyd's statement, he was saying, I can't breathe, but that statement seems to fall on deaf ears. And so I think it's very important for us to listen to each other before we just even if we disagree with what the problem is, or what potential solutions are, but that initial listening helps at least get us to the place where I understand where you're coming from.
Yes. And one of the things we've talked about, and I'm holding up my little booklet here on campus unrest, is a while back we did an interview with one of the authors of The Coddling of the American Mind, and he points out these untruths, what doesn't kill you make you weaker, always trust your emotions. Oh, yeah, that really works out really well. And most importantly, the life is a battle between good people and evil people. Part of the difficulty is this: we as Christians almost have to go out of our way sometimes to build a bridge, because as soon as you stray a little bit off of the, if you will, the song sheet or mindset or worldview of a person that might be a liberal progressive, or a person that might be secular, or a person that might be from another religion, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, Muslim, then you're immediately written off. And so in some respects, listening to each other is even harder than it used to be just a few years ago. Since I'm the old guy around the table, I can remember a time when we would sometimes say, well, I disagree with you, but at least I hear what you're saying. We may not agree. Now it's you're evil for having that view. And so that's going to mean that we as Christians are going to have to work even harder to be gracious, even harder to be civil, work even harder to listen carefully. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially, as we talk about this issue of race, that's one of the things that has been hard to try to communicate, that there's a difference between the concept of race and the concept of ethnicity, right? Like ethnicity from Greek, the ethnos, refers to ethnic groups or nations, nationalities. It's a combination of one's cultural background and their ethnic heritage. But race was a story that was basically created to say, with these arbitrary distinctions of skin color or hair texture or whatever, that there's another story that we're telling, and that your value is not tied to being made in the image of God. Instead, your value is tied to where you fall in a racial hierarchy, and benefits and disadvantages were established along those lines. And so it's important for people to understand that, in order to move the conversation forward, because oftentimes if I'm coming from a position of where the system has worked for me, I'm in the majority culture, then I've not necessarily been aware of that benefit or that story. But then someone that has been hurt by that same story will say, yeah, there is a story out there, and that this does resonate with me. And I think that's a hard thing to come to grips with when that's not been someone else's background. And so I think entering into those stories and hearing that perspective is so important, especially in the conversation about race, because it is tied to a different story than the one that we hold to as people that, take our Bible seriously.
Just before we run out of time, let's see if we can talk about the fact that we have a link to your Twitter account, a link to your Facebook page, of course, a link to Where You From podcast. And so for just a minute, Rasool, if you could talk about how people can use this, because there are listeners right now that are maybe pastors, Bible teachers, small group leaders, maybe just individuals that say, I'd really like to have this conversation around the table and maybe use your podcast to start that conversation. How can they use some of those resources?
Yeah, I kind of curated all of those resources in some of my writing on rasoolberry.com, and I try to strike a tone of collegiality and compassion, and really just kind of the biblical principle of, like in Galatians 6, of bearing with each other, even when we have disagreement. And so I think I try to create a space where people who don't agree, but who desperately want to learn and understand and are willing to hear a different perspective can do that, and always in a way that my identity is first rooted and grounded in the gospel of Jesus. And so that's the starting point. But yeah, you can feel free to engage with me on my Twitter handle or Facebook. And I definitely would love to interact with your listeners and others who want to just interact with the content that I have on those pages.
I really want people to do that. And his name, again, is rasoolberry.com, and that's Rasool with 2 O's. But, again, we have links on our website, pointofview.net, and that gives you a link there as well. And if nothing else, it has been funny because as I've shown this to various people or talked about that, when they come to your website, they said, gosh, I love that hair. If nothing else. Not to mention, your compassion, your articulate ability as an individual that interviews people, your ability to draw people out as an interviewer. So if nothing else, I just think you are a great resource for our listeners, and I wanted as many of them as possible to know about you. And I'm hoping this is not the only time. It's just first of many times that we can call on you and again.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, get into the area of apologetics. You've heard us talk about this before. We want you to know how to articulate a biblical worldview, but how to defend a biblical worldview. Dr. Joshua Chatraw, interestingly enough, really wants to kind of reimagine apologetics, and I like what he says, as we'll find out in the next hour, that in some respects, we've got to recognize that when Christianity really began to make an influence, it was in a first century where when people found out about Christianity, it wasn't a positive, it was a negative. And I've said before that the world we live in today, the 21st century, is more like the first century than any century that followed it. And now that we're kind of going back to a world where Christianity is not dominant, it's not even necessarily considered, maybe we need to kind of rethink how we begin to present the gospel. And he's got some great things on inside out apologetics and building blocks for apologetics and a number of other things. So it's really a fascinating book published by Zondervan. So we're going to spend an hour with him. And if some of these issues you'd like to get back into, well, don't forget, tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. We'll get into all those issues a lot on Friday, but we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. Pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you've listened to Point of View, you know that oftentimes we talk about the need for us to be able to articulate a biblical worldview and also to know how to defend a biblical worldview. And that second idea is what we oftentimes call apologetics. But if you've been listening to this program any length of time, you know that some people that do the area of apologetics sometimes have said we need to begin to rethink and maybe reframe and maybe, to use the word of the book we're going to talk about, reimagine apologetics. Now, does that mean that the message of the gospel has changed? No. Does that mean the truthfulness of Christianity has changed? No. But it does mean that the culture has changed, and in many ways, this 21st century world is kind of like the first century world. I've oftentimes said on this program that the centuries following the first century are very different than the first century, and now we find ourselves in a century not unlike that first century, where Christianity isn't a majority. Christianity isn't even seriously considered. Christianity is oftentimes seen as a negative, as it was in the first century. And so maybe we need to come back to some of those principles, and I think along the way maybe we've lost some of those. So that's one of the reasons we're going to talk about this new book, Telling a Better Story. It's published by Zondervan, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age, and it is written by Dr. Joshua Chatraw. If you're not familiar with him, you may have seen some of his books like Apologetics at the Cross or Truth Matters or Cultural Engagement. Some of those, of course, he's co-authored with. This one he's written by himself. Has a Ph.D. from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, serves as the executive director of the Center for Public Christianity, but he's also the theologian in residence at Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. Chatraw, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby. It's good to be here.
Let's, if we can, maybe get into how this book came about, because at the introduction there, it is interesting that Mark Allen says you sat down, and this is, I guess, 6 years ago now, talked about this idea of wanting to reimagine apologetics. And so after numerous meetings at Starbucks and at breakfasts and things like that, this book began to unfold, but a lot of that was due in large part to the concern that you had that we really find ourselves in a very different set of circumstances as we try to proclaim the gospel. Give us some background, if you might.
Yeah. Mark Allen's a great colleague. He's a PhD from Notre Dame, and he's also a pastor for 20 years. And so as we began to think through these issues, one of the things we realized is there was a way that we were both teaching at a university at the time, and there was a way that students were being trained to have conversations, which, to be kind of frank about it, we felt like might have worked 30 or 40 years ago, but just was not our experience, both for me doing college ministry and then in the church, and not for Mark for 20 years as a church planner and a pastor. And so one of the things we saw that had changed was, as you mentioned in your opening there, Kerby, that there was a time where the culture was warm to Christianity, even if you didn't buy that story of the resurrection, if you didn't even buy even this kind of notion that there is a God. Many people still saw Christianity as a social good, and so you could kind of
pop in some arguments there, or maybe in many cases, just give the gospel, call for repentance, and then refer them to the experts if they had any questions. But now the goodness and the beauty of the story of Christianity is seen as something that's not simply neutral, but something that many people don't see as good for society. And so when you're trying just to kind of jump to maybe kind of traditional arguments, you don't get much of a hearing. And so we began to say, okay, we need to help students actually be able to do this. And of course, that came from us doing it as well. And so that's kind of the background of how this book got going.
And more than once on this program, we've had one or two or maybe even more apologists that we interview say that it used to be the question was, is Christianity true? Now the question, as you pointed out, is Christianity good? And so it is very different. But early on in the book, you talk about the need to listen closely. That kind of relates to a conversation we just had last hour, because in some respects, listening and understanding what the issue is, what the barrier is, what the, if you will, concern is going to be even more important, don't you think, here in this 21st century world?
Yeah, and I would say, absolutely, and to add to that, I would say listen for what people are really wanting. What are the aspirations underneath what they're saying? And I think you hear this, for instance, with this, in what's going on right now in the United States, is people really want justice, and I think we should listen to that. We should do a lot of listening, and then say, okay, how, what story best makes sense out of this need for justice, or these notions of what we really need is the love. Well, let's do a lot of listening to that, but then at the right time say, what do we mean by love? And what story about the world, about the cosmos, best makes sense of this strong intuition we have that there is something good about loving each other. And so it's about listening, and then, hey, maybe there's something actually, and I think there is, buried about being human, about the kind of key features of personhood, especially in a culture that has been impacted by the gospel, it's part of the background. Even if people deny Christianity, it's very difficult to escape some of these kind of assumptions of Christianity once it gets into the bloodstream of a culture. So let's listen carefully to the aspirations and then be prepared to step into those and have conversations about them.
One of the things you talk about is the opportunity in post-Christendom. And I noticed that when I was speaking on college campuses. I don't do that now because I'm doing this radio show every day, but let's just go down the road from you, at Chapel Hill. Oh, I've heard it all before because I'm kind of surrounded by a lot of Christians. You go to a place like a Princeton or something like that, and they go, I've never met a Christian, so I'd kind of like to know what you have to say. There is a sense in which, because the world has changed and because some of the false ideas of Christianity are sort of leaking out, I'm running into lots and lots of young people, especially in the Gen Y or the Gen Z conversations, that say, I've never been to church. I really don't know Christians. So really, what do you guys really believe? And there's a sense of openness that hasn't existed, which in the past, it's, oh, yeah, you're just going to tell me something I already know because, I know Christians and I don't like them and I don't want to be one of them. So in some respects, this book, even though it recognizes that we live in a very different kind of postmodern, post-Christian world, presents an opportunity. So when we come back, we're going to break it down a little bit more. Part 1 is a better story about apologetics. Part 2 is offering a better story. And then Part 3, as you might imagine, is objections to the story. So we're going to take our time to kind of work through some of this. If you find yourself saying, this is a book I'd kind of like to read, it's a little over 200 pages. It's published by Zondervan. We have information about it on our website at pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We've We've all heard the phrase, the cure is worse than the disease. Some have applied that to the pandemic lockdown, but is that claim really true? Dr. Scott Atlas is both a physician and senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He and his colleagues looked at the accumulated years of life lost because of the lockdown. They used information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Bureau of Labor, along with various actuarial tables. Lost economic output in the U.S. alone is estimated to be 5% of GDP, or about $1.1 trillion for each month of the lockdown. They use a conservative average of one additional life lost for every 17 million of income lost, resulting in 65,000 lives lost in the U.S. for each month because of the economic shutdown. Then there are lives lost due to delayed or foregone health care. Some were prevented from getting screenings. Others avoided hospitals for fear of getting the virus. Treatment delays resulted in 8,000 U.S. deaths per month for another 120,000 years of remaining life. Missed strokes contributed an additional loss of 100,000 years of life lost for each month. Late cancer diagnosis lost 250,000 years of remaining life. Now, the expected lifetimes of COVID-19 patients who died account for about 800,000 lost years of life. Even the most conservative estimate for the life lost from the lockdown already exceeds 1.5 million years of lost life. Essentially, the lockdown will account for more years of lost life than the virus itself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Joshua Chatraw as we talk about telling a better story, how to talk about God in a skeptical age. It's published by Zondervan, and I think you're going to find it very helpful as he's helping us kind of reimagine this idea of apologetics. And Dr. Chatraw, in the first section, you talk about a better story about apologetics, and actually near the end of that section, there's a great diagram, but maybe you can kind of explain it, kind of the idea of a building block apologetics versus an inside-out apologetics, because in some respects, we've always sort of started with, logic and the arguments for the existence of God and historical evidence for Jesus and the gospel. And not that that's wrong, but in this world, there may be a better way to begin to communicate that. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah. I think obviously arguments for God and using logic is really important, and so that's part of the approach I'm suggesting for our moment. But I think oftentimes what happens is we have a larger story that we've either assumed. Oftentimes, people we talk to, whether they realize it or not, have assumed a story about the world, and then they fit their kind of logic within that. They fit their kind of value system within that, and what's meaningful and what's significant and what's beautiful and what's good. And so if you're simply saying, I'm going to start from logic and argue up, oftentimes it's this bigger story that's dictating the moves they make. If they're actually kind of trying to work this out consciously, oftentimes it's working out subconsciously. So what we suggest is, when you come into a conversation, or even if you're speaking to a group, you try to get a sense of what are really the dominant cultural stories, especially for the group you're talking to or the person you're talking to. And so there's these different stories. Some of them are micro stories, and all you have to do is watch some movies, and you pick this up, the story of achievement. You are what your CV, your resume says you are. The story of consumerism, you are what you buy. The story of romance, I think these are the stories that fill not only the songs we listen to, but the movies we watch. And they become kind of the defining narrative that people live by. And also there's these kind of grand stories, the kind of story about, there is no God, and therefore there is no meaning, and therefore just do whatever you want. Now that's a hard pill to swallow, and oftentimes we hear more of an optimistic secular story in these days, which is there is no God, therefore we define our own meaning, and that's a really exciting thing. And so what I'm suggesting in the book is let's listen for these stories, and those are just a few examples of them, and then try to enter in those stories. And ask and learn to ask the right questions. And so learn to look for those aspirations I mentioned in the last segment. And to begin to talk to someone and about, what they find meaningful, what they find valuable, what their hopes are for the future. Is there really any significance in anything that we do as humans? And then begin to find what we can affirm. Is there something here we can affirm? But then what can we challenge? What, if you take to the logical conclusion, is going to cause them a lot of discomfort and problems? And then how do we then take them out from their story to the gospel story, to tell a better story, where they really can find the love, true love that they were made for as human beings, where they can really find meaning that even suffering can't take away. They can find true justice from a God who one day will return to bring justice to the world. So I think the aspirations are buried in these stories, and we have to learn how to interact with them rather than just be a kind of approach to apologetics, which is us versus them. How do we come along and think with them?
Well, and it does seem to me that what you also are doing is, when you're asking the question, helping them to understand the basis upon which they're living their lives. Let's take the most negative one, what you call the pessimistic secular story, that the whole world came into existence because of a big bang. There is no good, no bad. There just is. We're just, in a sense, pieces of DNA moving around. We have a brain, which is a meat computer that we use to come up with ideas. And I think it seems to me the question that you have is, well, where do you get any meaning or significance out of that? For that matter, if you believe that all you are is more evolved than the animals, or just more along the evolutionary chain than the rocks around you, why is there any value in human beings? Why would you be concerned about racism or genocide or sexual trafficking or anything? Sooner or later, they got to go, okay, yeah, it bothers me. I've got to think about that. And that sort of then gets you into that whole idea of imagining a better meaning, because if you take that one and say, gosh, there really isn't any meaning to life, there's no reason, if I really accept that worldview of getting out of bed in the morning, that starts them down a path, doesn't it, in terms of self-examination and maybe being more open to the gospel?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kerby. And I think the way you described it there is really good, because one of the things that I point out in the book is often for a variety of reasons, we feel pushed back in the culture. We feel intimidated at times. I think at times Christians, we can have an inferiority complex, and we need to admit that. But when we go into the conversation thinking, I'm about to pulverize this other person with my Christian worldview, you can understand where they're going to kind of not want to listen to you. And I think instead, I feel really good about our argument here. So let's just, take a deep breath and let this other person talk and engage them and say, hey, what do you do for meaning? Tell me about that. Where do you get your meaning in life? And I think they'll say things we can affirm. My kids, philanthropic things I do, I find value. I think there's a lot of things we can say, that's great. But if we're just assigning meaning, and ultimately there's no ultimate meaning in that, our relationships aren't going to last forever, as good as they are. And sometimes they fall apart. And when we begin to kind of press into these existential features of personhood, the story begins to unravel. There becomes cracks in their story. And I think that at that time, it's an opportunity to apply the gospel. And so what you're not having to do is go through this huge chain of argumentation. We have to become better listeners. And then where are the cracks at here? Where are the cracks in their story? The language I use in the book are, where are the holes in their plot line? They've got holes in their storyline. And then often they're actually borrowing from Christianity and they don't know it. So here's a real opportunity for, yeah, go ahead, Kerby.
No, I was going to say that's really the key point is that, as we've talked about before, what they tend to do is they think that they're living consistently with their worldview, but in order to even make judgments about good or bad or meaning or happiness, they have to borrow from Christianity, don't they?
Well, and at least theism, right? I mean, at least theism, but at least some kind of, at least some belief in God or transcendence. But particularly when you're talking about what Once Loster calls the kind of modern moral order, things like human rights, and we, I talk about human rights in the book, or universal benevolence, which is basically saying it's not just that we should care about other people that are in your neighborhood that happen to, if I treat them nice in my neighborhood, they'll treat me nice, and our neighborhood will get together, get along better. But no, the modern moral order says, no, we need to treat everybody with love and respect and with dignity, even if we don't know them, even if, me treating them well isn't going to have any immediate value for me. Okay. And so once you adopt these, which secular humanism, this kind of optimistic story about the world today has, I think there's this really good scholars and really good historians who've made the case really strongly that those have been injected into our culture a long time ago, in the first century with this man named Jesus.
That's right.
And at times it has taken, some things have popped up really quick. People have drawn certain implications more immediately, and sometimes this took longer. And to the church's shame, we didn't see some of the implications of his message. But it is in our culture. And so I have this line in the book. I think I say something like, your non-Christian friends might be more Christian than you realize, or they realize.
We've seen that before.
And I'm not saying that. Yeah. I'm not saying that everyone is, a born-again believer. Actually, no, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is they have imbibed some Christian assumptions and beliefs, and they don't even know it.
And you can show them the connections.
So,
let me take a break because I want to come back and talk about this idea of offering a better story, because 5 points, imagining better meaning, better true self, a better happiness, better inclusiveness, better reasons. And then we'll get into some of the objections to the story. And we just have one of those mandatory breaks. So we'll take a break and come back and spend a little more time talking about this book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age. All that coming up right after these important messages.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Joshua Chatraw as we talk about his book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age, published by Zondervan. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but as always, we have a link on our website. You can get it in paperback or Kindle. Some great material and just a number of accolades from various individuals, some of whom have been on the program with us before. And I thought it might be good, if nothing else, Joshua, to just maybe spend a little bit of time talking about the middle section. It's kind of the meat of the book, imagining a better meaning, imagining a better true self, happiness, inclusiveness, reason. Let's talk about this idea of imagining a better meaning. And almost immediately you talk about when nothing seems to be missing. You know, we run into some individuals. We even had a testimony the other day of an individual that had achieved incredible levels of success in the sports world, that then at the end, when you're at the pinnacle, it's still really empty. But I also run into some people that go, you know, I'm pretty good with my life. You know, I don't feel too like I have much of a need at all. So how do we begin to approach the self-satisfied person, and then also the individual that as they're maybe going along trying to achieve some level of success, finally sense that sense of emptiness, which only could be satisfied by a commitment to Jesus Christ?
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a real problem. I mean, I think there's a kind of a spiritual apathy that we're facing, where people just don't. When they say, you know, I don't see the relevance. I think this is what's behind that. When you hear that talking to someone who says, I just don't see how Christianity is relevant. And I think with that, they're saying, listen, I don't have any needs. I'm good. And when you achieve a certain technological success, you know, when you're on this side of the Enlightenment, and we're looking at all that we kind of have going for us, and if you're in a certain socioeconomic class, you know, this becomes a possibility in a way that it wasn't for most people of all human history. Kind of, I mean, just to be like, oh, you know, I don't find any relevance in the notion of God or transcendence. It'd just be kind of foreign. So, like I said, like we began this conversation, like there's some kind of unique challenges in that. And I think one of the things, though, is kind of, to go back to our previous segment, is that buried within, they're still living with some kind of purpose. And oftentimes, because maybe they're not experiencing suffering or tragedy at the moment, they don't feel the existential weight of death. And I think death has this way of kind of waking us up. I mean, I think moments of unrest like we're experiencing has this kind of, okay, hang on, what's going on? So, you know, pain and suffering has tended people to you know, draw people away from God, yes, at times, but also draw people to God. And I think, so one of the things I'm trying to do in this chapter is I find that there's certain pressure points.
Right.
And like a good doctor, we need to be careful, right? Because we can come in and say, well, you don't have any purpose, you don't have any meaning. And, you know, they're going to quickly list off things that they find, you know, that they've created for purpose and meaning. But I think instead we can acknowledge that, yes, those things that they're pursuing I can understand why those are important, and those are, we can acknowledge at a certain level those are good things, but they're also really fragile things too. And what happens when those things start slipping away and we feel the anxiety and the weight of possibly losing the very things, the very webs of meaning that we've built for ourselves? And what happens when we start feeling, as we are now, I mean, many are today, like things unraveling around us? And I think very quickly in that there's this kind of, it can be this despair and this reaching for something more, what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls a sense of fullness that's lacking in our present moment. And I think those are opportunities. Let's keep our ears open and look for those opportunities to kind of apply the right amount of pressure on those pressure points of purpose, of the sense of our fragility and death, and then take them to the gospel. And I think this gospel story is there in their background, if they're in Western culture. And I also think it's somewhere buried deep in the human soul. So let's have confidence in that story, that it is the true story of reality, and connect it up with these pressure points.
And this idea of imagining a better meaning is kind of a cultural assumption that I don't need God or religion. But let's take the next one then, true self. The cultural assumption there is, well, you have to be true to yourself. But how do you respond to somebody that simply says, well, that's, I just got to be true to what I believe, and I don't really need anything other than that. You take them through some questions like justice and a variety of morality and others. And so talk about how that might be used in a way to reach out to the unconvinced.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you start saying that's kind of, as long as I'm true to myself, that's, everyone's got to be true to themselves. And I think what we want to say there is, well, several things. One is, if you imagine that by saying there somehow you can look at this core part of your humanity that's not attached to everything going on external to you, that's just impossible. We are historical embodied beings, and with that, it means we're always going to be affected by what's going on around us. A story that I sometimes say was when I was in middle school and I was kind of trying to find myself, maybe if we use this expression, trying to find the true me, if I was jumping from kind of one middle school subgroup to another and I was rebelling, I would never kind of show up in a toga, to school or something. It was always, there was limited possibilities of who I was going to dress like and who I was going to try to imitate. And so when we say, I'm going to try to find the true me, and you're always looking around to the external world. So you can't do it is one thing. It's also when you're trying to do it, there's this fragility to that, because if you're just basing it on emotions, well, our emotions are always, are in flux. And so there's this instability of always kind of trying to say, okay, how do I feel today? And that's the true me. And so we are looking to external stories is the reality. And so let's name that. Let's say we actually are doing that. And then how are those stories that people are telling that we're looking to of, that we see in Disney movies or Nike commercials, how are they doing about giving us a stable identity or morality or or justice? How are they, do they actually provide these fundamental features, I would say, of personhood? How are they actually giving us those things? So if you take, for instance, justice, in order to really get at justice, we need to think through, do we have a grounds for justice? Is there, we talk about universal human dignity and our obligation to care for others, or what story actually gives us a ground? Because if it's just look inside yourself, then there is no obligation to treat others with justice. If when I look inside myself, I want to do what I want to do. In other words, if we don't have this obligation to pursue justice according to a certain standard, then what we have is the story that the culture is saying, just look inside yourself, is actually in tension with this other story that we're saying, which is we need to get justice. And so I think the Christian story, and this is what I try to do in the book, actually gives us a true solid identity that we can have stability with, and also gives us a story for justice, so we're not just swept away by the cultural stories that are fleeting and coming and going, really at a rapid pace these days.
Let's, if we can, take a break, and we come back. I want to get into one of the larger chapters, Imagining a Better Happiness. The ultimate goal in life is to be happy. Oh, have we heard that before? And I just wanted to, if nothing else, talk about that. And these are all part of the section on offering a better story. And, of course, there's also some great material about objections to the story as well. And if you find yourself saying, oh, this might be something very helpful, I'm really kind of wanting to think about, is there a better way to present the gospel? Is there a way to tap into some of the cliches that I hear? I just want to be happy. I just have to be true to myself. Well, I don't really need God. All the sorts of other ideas. These really provide, I think, a great starting point. A lot of it, of course, involves the ability to listen. and to interact, and then to be able to address some of the questions or objections. But if nothing else, I just thought that it would be very helpful, because we are living in a time where people aren't so much asking, is Christianity true? They're asking, is it good? And frankly, most of them aren't even asking. They just simply say, I'm fine without a religion, don't really see any need for it, and if that's good for you, great, but it's not even relevant to my life. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about how maybe to scratch some of those places where there's a potential itch that they don't know, to begin to raise some questions, some issues, to get some deeper thought. And even if we don't get the great answers today, we might put a pebble in their shoe and get them thinking about that as they walk along in life. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Now for a few more minutes as we talk about the book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age. Dr. Joshua Chatraw with us as we talk about one of the other chapters, Imagining a Better Happiness. Now, both of the ones we've just talked about, that is, I don't really need God, and I got to true to myself, are certainly significant ones. But one that you certainly run into oftentimes is the ultimate goal in life is to be happy. And it's this idea that I have kind of a moralistic, therapeutic deism, you know. Maybe there's a God, maybe not, but my happiness is the big issue. And frankly, for some of them, they may not articulate it, but they're thinking, if I become a Christian, well, that's not going to make me happy. It's going to make me have to do all sorts of things and believe all sorts of things I don't want to believe. So how do we do that? And how do we engage individuals who are convinced that the ultimate goal in life is happiness?
Yeah. Well, again, I think this is one of those opportunities for us to kind of have to think carefully and to think with some nuance. There's a work by a sociologist by the name of Philip Reif in the 1960s called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And he said one of the things that's going on is, and I think his book was prophetic, was that this quest to feel better would overshadow the quest for justice, for things like justice and forgiveness and redemption. And so as long as we feel better, and I think, every time somebody says, as long as you're happy, I think maybe Philip Reif's thesis has been proven true. Now, I'm not saying that there's never a time where, in context, that's maybe okay, but I think that has become a kind of dominant, well, whatever you want to do in this situation, as long as you're happy. And I think what ends up happening there is even among us as Christians, there can be a subtle shift within our assumption of how we're to live our life. Now, I do think that there's this notion of the good life, and I think Christianity does give the good life. It is the good life, but it's not working with the same type of category, so to speak. And so there's some contrast. Let me give you three contrasts, I would say, between the Christian story and then this other way to pursue the good life, or these other ways to pursue happiness. And I think one is that this type of therapeutic rationalism assumes that we can kind of just achieve happiness on our own. And the Christian story is much more realistic, I think, about what we see and about the human experience, which is that after the fall, that we're never going to actually get to perfect happiness until Christ returns. And so there's this realism that suffering and pain and loss is part of our plight now. And that's something that we have to deal with. And so we have to ask the question of how can we thrive in the midst of a world full of suffering and pain? I think Christianity actually gives us the resources to do that, and I go into the book and talk more about that. I think another contrast here is the Christian story sees physical pain and emotional distress as a kind of sign that there's something bigger underneath the surface.
Right.
And so, when you I love this quote from David Foster Wallace, who's a novelist, wasn't a Christian, but he says, he died about 10 years ago, but before his death, he said, in most cultures, if you hurt, it means that you're having symptoms that something deeper is wrong, that something in the system is wrong. And so it's like there's a fire alarm going off because there's a fire, not just simply because there's a fire alarm going off.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things going on in our narrative today is that, despite all our technology, despite all the kind of therapeutic practices, all the things that's going on, and, we sense that something is the matter in the world. Something is not right.
Right.
And you don't need to be a Christian to sense that. You sense it. We sense it deep in our bones. And what the Christian story does is it says, yes, that's right. There is something going on, but we can't just treat this symptoms. There's something deeper going on. And if we're just trying to eliminate this kind of external feeling, we never get at the cancer. And there's a lot of people who are doing writing from a secular perspective today who's trying to convince us that, no, really, everything is great. Everything is fine. This is the best time ever in human history. And I think, again, we need to be nuanced about this. I think they make some pretty good arguments on certain things, but if you look at the social fabric, if you look at relationships, I don't think you have to go very far in looking at mental health figures to realize, no, we've also got some big problems, despite all our technology and despite some gains in society. And then I think the last thing we need to say here, and that I say in the book as far as in contrast, is that the Christian story teaches the only way to find true joy is to deny yourself.
Yes.
I call this the paradox of joy.
Right.
In other words, if you're seeking out happiness as an end to itself, what actually happens is you don't get it.
Yeah.
But instead, the way that this is the fabric of the universe, that when you turn from self and you turn towards others, and you turn ultimately towards God, then what actually happens is you do experience this joy. It's still tinged with suffering and pain and the realities of this present world, but then something. This is the heart of the gospel, right? To find your life, you must lose it. And so this is actually the very fabric that we live by. And so I think people sense little glimmers of this, like when they altruistically give themselves to their kids,
right,
and they're non-believers. And it's in that, and they say, yes, I would give anything for my kids. And I say, what's the most, or for my spouse? And I say, is that the most flourishing relationship in your life? And oftentimes I say, without a doubt. And so here you have this little pointer, I think, this little sign that says, see, it's when we're giving ourselves, it's when we're giving ourselves self-sacrificially that we actually flourish. And what if that's the very fabric of the universe? Because our God, and then we can go theologically on them. The Christianity has said God in his very being is this God who exists in 3 and 1. And he's always loved and always has been giving, is this self-giving God.
Very good.
And so the fabric of the universe is designed after the very character of God, and that forms the heart of our morality.
Well, it gives you a pretty good idea of the book. Of course, we have not looked at all the chapters here, but we did try to at least give you a little bit of an idea of a better story about apologetics. We looked at a couple of better story offerings, and of course, there's a whole section there on objections. But if nothing else, I think it's really a call to rethink the way in which we communicate the gospel and how we do apologetics. So, Dr. Joshua Chatraw, thank you for being with us here on Point of View. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an entire hour just to spend some time digging into it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we are going to have our Friday weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts will be with us. We'll be getting back into all sorts of issues. You know, you think about everything from the pandemics, and you think about the protest, and we think about some of the other issues that have been in the news. We'll certainly spend some time talking about all of that. So if you find yourself saying, I really like to get back into some of these topics in the news, well, that's exactly what we're going to do tomorrow. If you find yourself saying, you know, you've had some great interviews today, you've talked with Rasool Berry, and I'd like to know a little bit more about what he's doing in trying to put together podcasts to address many of these issues culturally, you have information about him on the website. If you find yourself saying, I'd kind of like to get a copy of Joshua Chatraw's book, well, we have a link to that as well on our website. And as you go there, you might even want to go back and listen to it again. You can click on the podcast and download that and listen to it, or simply go to the YouTube channel and find that as well. I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes, and Steve as well. I hope you will join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.